This is the story of Marianne, a woman who married a wealthy man for love, only to be branded a gold digger by his bitter, entitled family the moment he dies. Stripped of dignity, isolated from friends, and threatened with legal action to contest the will, she is forced to fight for her name and her place in a family that never wanted her. The turning point comes when a letter, written by her husband before his death and hidden for a reason only he understood, surfaces and exposes the truth, not just about his love for her, but about the family's own long-buried secrets, motives, and betrayals. What begins as a story of grief and humiliation becomes a story of vindication, justice, and quiet triumph. The rain fell like it had rehearsed the moment, soft and relentless against the black umbrellas gathered around the grave. Marianne stood at the edge of the crowd, her fingers white around a single white rose, watching the casket that held everything she had ever wanted lowered into the earth. 12 years of marriage, 12 years of laughter behind closed doors, of quiet mornings and stolen glances no one else had been allowed to witness. Now, the world watched instead. She felt the silence shift before she heard the voice. "She doesn't even have the decency to cry properly," Eleanor said, loud enough for the front 3 rows to hear, her voice cutting through the drizzle like a blade through silk. Heads turned. Whispers rippled outward like water disturbed by a stone. 12 years, Eleanor continued, stepping toward her son's grave as though claiming it. And not once did she love him the way a wife should. She loved what he could give her. Marianne's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to defend a marriage no one else had been permitted to see. But grief had stolen her voice, and shame, undeserved, unearned, rushed in to fill the silence. Somewhere, hidden in a drawer, she didn't yet know existed, her husband had already answered them. 3 years before the funeral, Marianne had been nobody in the eyes of David's world. A receptionist at a downtown architecture firm, counting coffee breaks and rent due dates, never imagining a man like him would notice her at all. But he did, every Tuesday. David arrived early for meetings he didn't need to attend early for, just to lean against her desk and ask about her weekend, her book, her day. She thought he was teasing her at first. Men like David didn't fall for women like her, but he did fall, quietly, stubbornly, completely. Their first real conversation happened during a fire drill, of all things, both of them standing on the sidewalk in the cold while he asked if she believed in second chances. She hadn't known yet that he was asking for himself, escaping a life of arranged expectations and family obligations dressed up as love. She only knew that his eyes held something raw and unguarded, something none of his polished world ever saw. 6 months later, he proposed with no ring, no plan, just a whispered promise in her kitchen. "I choose you, every version of my life, forever." His mother refused to attend the wedding. His sister sent a card with no signature. Marianne told herself families needed time. She believed love could soften even the coldest rooms, that patience and grace would eventually be enough. She didn't know then that some rooms were never meant to be softened, only survived. And she didn't know that the very love that made her feel chosen would one day make her the most hated woman in a family that had never once let her in. It happened on a Tuesday, the same day of the week they'd fallen in love. Though Marianne wouldn't notice that cruelty until much later. David had complained of a headache that morning, nothing more than a dull ache behind his eyes, the kind he usually shook off with coffee and a joke about getting older. She'd kissed his forehead on her way out the door, told him to rest, promised to bring home soup. She never got the chance. The call came at 2:47 in the afternoon, and she would remember that number for the rest of her life. The exact arbitrary cruelty of a clock. A collapse at his office. An aneurysm, sudden and silent, the kind that gives no warning and asks no permission. By the time she reached the hospital, her shoes still damp from the rain outside. David was already gone, his hand still faintly warm when she took it in the sterile hush of the room. The world did not stop to let her catch up. There was no space to grieve, no quiet corner to fall apart in. Within hours, phones were ringing. Lawyers, funeral directors, David's mother demanding details in a voice sharp enough to cut glass. Marianne moved through the following days like a ghost haunting her own life, signing papers she couldn't read through swollen eyes, nodding at condolences that felt like accusations already forming beneath polite smiles. She kept reaching for him in empty rooms. She kept setting 2 coffee cups out of habit, then staring at the second one like it belonged to a stranger. Grief, she was learning, wasn't a wave. It was a house with no doors, every room leading back to him, every hallway ending in silence, and somewhere beneath that silence, unseen and unclaimed, sat a letter David had written weeks before his death, sealed with instructions no one had yet found the courage, or reason, to follow. By the 3rd day, the house no longer felt like hers. David's sister, Camille, arrived unannounced with a set of keys Marianne didn't know existed, moving through the rooms with the practiced ease of someone reclaiming territory rather than mourning a brother. "We just want to make sure everything is accounted for," she said, opening drawers she had no right to open, her eyes lingering too long on anything with value. Marianne said nothing. She was too tired to fight, too raw to notice yet that the fighting had already begun. The calls started next. Lawyers she hadn't hired, appraisers she hadn't scheduled, a family accountant asking pointed questions about joint accounts and asset transfers in a tone that assumed guilt before evidence. Every conversation carried an undertone she couldn't quite name until Eleanor said it outright, cornering her in the kitchen with a voice pitched low and venomous. "You knew what you were doing when you married him," Eleanor said. "Women like you always do. Women like her." The phrase lodged itself under Marianne's skin like a splinter she couldn't dig out. She began noticing the small exclusions first, decisions about the funeral made without her, family meetings she wasn't invited to, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room. It wasn't accusation yet, not fully. It was something quieter and more insidious, the slow, deliberate erasure of her place in a life she had built for over a decade. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the whispers weren't really about her at all. They were about fear. Fear of what David might have left behind. Fear of a truth some of them had spent years trying to bury. And that truth was closer than anyone realized. The family meeting happened without her at first, a closed-door gathering in the study. David had once used for late-night phone calls and quiet whiskey, now repurposed as a war room against the woman who had loved him. When Marianne was finally summoned in, 5 faces turned toward her with the same expression, not grief, but calculation. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, like a queen holding court. Beside her, Camille and her husband exchanged glances loaded with rehearsed certainty. David's uncle, a retired judge who had never once remembered Marianne's name correctly, cleared his throat as though preparing to deliver a verdict. "We've spoken with the family attorney," Eleanor began, folding her hands with theatrical composure. "There are concerns about the marriage, about the will, about whether David was of sound mind when certain provisions were made." Marianne felt the floor tilt beneath her. Sound mind? David was the sharpest man I've ever known. And bats. Many vets. "Grief makes people vulnerable," Eleanor continued, ignoring her entirely, speaking now to the room rather than to her. "Vulnerable people are exploited. It happens more than you'd think. A woman with nothing meeting a man with everything." "I loved him." Marianne's voice cracked, but she forced the words out anyway. "I loved him before I knew what he had." "That's what they all say," Camille said quietly, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. The uncle slid a folder across the table. The first formal legal threat, dressed up in careful language about contesting the will, about protecting the family legacy, about undue influence. Marianne stared at the papers without truly seeing them, the words blurring into a single unbearable message. You do not belong here. You never did. She was one woman against generations of money, lawyers on retainer, and a story they had already decided to believe. Old money did not need truth. It needed only consensus, and in that room, consensus had already been reached, long before she'd walked through the door. The calls stopped first. Friends who had once filled her voicemail with casual invitations, brunch, book club, a glass of wine after a long week, grew quiet, then apologetic, then silent altogether. Marianne told herself it was grief, keeping people at a distance, the awkwardness of not knowing what to say to a widow, but grief didn't explain the sideways glances at the grocery store, or the way old acquaintances suddenly found urgent reasons to end conversations early. Eleanor's version of events had traveled faster than truth ever could. By the second week, David's business partners stopped returning her calls entirely. She discovered, through a terse email rather than a conversation, that she'd been removed from meetings regarding the company he'd spent 15 years building. No one asked her opinion. No one seemed to remember, she'd sat beside him through late nights and early failures, that she'd believed in his vision before investors ever did. Then came the letter from the family's law firm. Formal, cold, threatening a will contest on grounds of undue influence, listing the house, the accounts, the very roof over her head as assets now under review. She sat alone in the kitchen that night, the same kitchen where David had once knelt with no ring and only a promise, and did the math on a life that no longer felt like her own. Legal fees she couldn't afford. A support system quietly dismantled, friend by friend, meeting by meeting. A house that might not be hers much longer, despite 12 years of mornings spent in it. A house. For the first time since the funeral, Marianne allowed herself to cry. Not for David's absence, which she'd carried since the day he died, but for the terrifying realization that grief alone would not be enough to save her. She would need to fight, and she had no idea, not yet, that David had already begun fighting for her, in the only way he had left. The law office smelled of leather and old paper. The kind of room built to intimidate rather than comfort. Marianne sat at one end of the long mahogany table, Eleanor and the rest of the family arranged like a jury at the other, their faces already arranged into expressions of suspicion before a single word had been read aloud. David's attorney, a soft-spoken man named Harold who had known him since university, cleared his throat and began. The preliminary bequests were modest, a donation to the hospital where David's father had once been treated, a trust for his old college roommate's children, a generous sum to the housekeeper who had worked for the family for 2 decades. The room remained still, patient, waiting for the moment that mattered. Then Harold turned the page. "To my wife, Marianne," he read, his voice steady despite the tension thickening the air. "I leave the entirety of my primary estate, including the house, my controlling shares in the company, and the remainder of my personal accounts, in recognition of a partnership built on truth, patience, and a love I never once had to question. My York." Silence detonated across the table. Eleanor's face drained of color before flushing crimson, her hands gripping the table's edge as though she might overturn it. "That's impossible," she said, voice climbing. "David would never. He wouldn't leave his family with nothing. She manipulated him. She must have." "Ah, there's more," Harold interrupted gently, though his eyes flicked toward Marianne with something unreadable. "David left a personal letter, to be delivered separately, at a time of his choosing rather than mine. My instructions were explicit. It has not yet been located." Camille's composure cracked entirely. "A letter? What letter? What does it say? I don't know, Harold admitted. David didn't share its contents with me. The room erupted into overlapping voices, accusations, demands, Eleanor already gesturing toward the family's attorney with instructions to begin contesting the will immediately, before Marianne could, in her words, hide anything else. Marianne sat frozen amid the chaos, David's own words echoing in her mind. A love I never once had to question. Somewhere, in a place only he had known, David had left her one final gift. She just had to find it before they destroyed her, trying to take it away. Within a week, Marianne learned what it felt like to be investigated by people who had once called themselves family. The private investigator was subtle, at first. A woman in a gray sedan parked across from the house. A series of calls to her previous employer asking routine questions about her work history and character. Then subtlety gave way to aggression. Old college friends reported being contacted, asked leading questions about whether Marianne had ever discussed David's money before the wedding, whether she'd shown interest in his family's business dealings, whether anyone had ever heard her express doubt about the marriage. The formal legal filing arrived by courier on a gray Thursday morning. A petition to contest the will on grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity, thick with language designed to paint David as a vulnerable man exploited in his final years rather than the sharp, decisive husband she had known. Attached was a list of demands, a deposition, financial disclosures going back a decade, access to personal correspondence between her and David that she hadn't even known still existed. Worse than the legal threats were the whispers that followed her now everywhere she went. A neighbor mentioned, with false sympathy, having heard she'd been asked to leave several previous jobs under mysterious circumstances, a lie so specific it could only have been manufactured deliberately. A former coworker called to warn her that someone claiming to be a journalist had been asking pointed questions about her finances before the marriage, questions clearly meant to plant a narrative rather than uncover truth. Marianne began to understand, with a chill settling deep in her chest, that this wasn't simply grief curdling into blame. This was calculated, coordinated. Someone with resources and motive was working methodically to destroy her credibility before she could defend herself, or before she could find whatever David had hidden. The question that kept her awake now wasn't whether she would survive the accusations. It was why the family was fighting so hard to bury a truth they hadn't even seen yet. She hadn't meant to go through his study that night. She'd only wanted to find his old cardigan, the one that still smelled faintly of him, something to hold on to during the hours grief made unbearable. But her hand brushed against the underside of his desk while reaching for a fallen book, and she felt it. A seam where there shouldn't have been one, a shallow compartment disguised as part of the woodwork. Her fingers trembled as she pried it open. Inside sat a single brass key, small and unremarkable, tied with a thin loop of string to a folded scrap of paper. She unfolded it carefully, her breath catching at the sight of David's handwriting. The same careless slanted script that had once filled birthday cards and love notes left on her pillow. For the drawer only I know about. Trust the truth, even when it's inconvenient. D. Marianne sat back on her heels, heart hammering. What drawer? What truth? She searched the study for an hour before she found it. A small antique cabinet tucked behind rows of law books, one she'd always assumed was purely decorative, a relic from David's grandfather's era. The key fit perfectly, turning with a soft, satisfying click that felt louder than it should have in the silent house. Inside lay a single sealed envelope, yellowed slightly with time, her name written across the front in David's unmistakable hand. Beneath it, tucked deeper into the drawer, sat something else entirely. A stack of old documents, bank statements, and photographs that seemed to have nothing to do with her at all. She reached for the envelope first, her hands shaking. Whatever David had wanted her to find, he had wanted her to find all of it, not just his love, but the truth beneath his family's carefully constructed silence. Marianne's hands shook as she broke the seal, the paper crackling with the particular fragility of something meant to outlast its writer. David's handwriting filled the page, steadier than she expected, as though he'd known exactly what he wanted to say and had said it without hesitation. My love, if you're reading this, then the thing I feared most has happened. Not just my death, but what came after it. I know my family. I know what grief will make them capable of, because I watched them do it before, to someone else who deserved better. You need to understand something I should have told you years ago. My father didn't build this company alone. He built it with a partner, a man named Thomas Reyes, brilliant and trusting, who believed in fairness the way you believe in it. When the company needed capital to survive its first hard winter, my father restructured the ownership papers while Thomas was hospitalized after an accident, using a power of attorney. Thomas had signed in good faith for medical decisions only. By the time Thomas recovered, he owned nothing. My father called it survival. I call it theft. Thomas died penniless 11 years later. My mother knew. She has always known. She helped draft the story the family still tells at dinner parties. The story where my father built everything from nothing, alone, through sheer brilliance and grit. I found the original documents in my 20s, buried in a filing cabinet my father thought no one would ever open. I confronted him. He told me some truths were better left buried, that the company's survival justified whatever had been necessary to secure it. I was young and afraid of losing everything I'd been raised to inherit, so I said nothing. That silence has haunted me every year since. When I met you, Marianne, I finally understood what my family had truly lost the day they chose money over honesty. Not just Thomas's trust, but their own capacity for it. You loved me before you knew what I had. You never once asked about the company, the accounts, the inheritance. You asked about my day. You asked if I was happy. No one in my family has asked me that in 20 years. I know they will come for you the moment I'm gone. I know my mother's fear of losing control will disguise itself as concern for the family legacy. I know she will call you a manipulator because it is easier than admitting what manipulation actually looks like. Because she has lived inside it her whole life. The documents beneath this letter are the originals. The altered ownership papers. Thomas's medical power of attorney. Correspondence proving my father and mother both knew exactly what they'd done. I made copies years ago and gave them to Harold with instructions to act if you were ever threatened. Don't fight them with anger, my love. Fight them with truth. It is the one weapon they have never learned to defend against, because they never expected anyone brave enough to use it. I chose you because you were honest in a world that taught me honesty was a weakness. Prove them wrong. Prove me right. Ma, I love you. I have never once questioned this marriage. Don't let them make you question it either. David. Marianne sat motionless for a long time, the letter trembling in her hands, the drawer's other contents suddenly making terrible, perfect sense. She wasn't holding evidence of her own innocence anymore. She was holding the truth that would unmake them. She called the meeting herself this time. Harold's office looked the same as it had during the will reading, but Marianne walked in differently now. Spine straight, the sealed folder of documents held against her chest like armor rather than evidence. Eleanor arrived with her lawyer, already composing her face into practiced disdain, clearly expecting another round of accusations she could deflect with wounded outrage. I assume this is about the will contest, Eleanor said, settling into her chair with theatrical patience. If you've come to negotiate, Marianne, I should tell you now. I'm not here to negotiate. Marianne's voice didn't shake. She'd rehearsed this moment in the mirror for 3 nights, but standing in it now, she found she didn't need the rehearsal at all. The truth carried its own steadiness. I'm here to talk about Thomas Reyes. The color drained from Eleanor's face so completely that even her lawyer glanced at her, confused by the sudden shift in the room's temperature. I don't know who that is, Eleanor said, too quickly, too thin. Marianne opened the folder and began placing documents on the table, one by one, David's careful voice echoing in her mind with every page. The altered ownership papers, the medical power of attorney, signed for a hospital stay, weaponized for a hostile takeover, bank statements showing payments made to keep old lawyers, old accountants, old witnesses quiet for over 2 decades. David found these years ago, Marianne said. He made copies. He gave them to Harold, with instructions to use them if I was ever threatened by this family, the way Thomas Reyes was threatened by his. I'm Kay. Quo our due. Camille's composure cracked first, her eyes darting toward her mother with something that looked almost like fear. Mom, is this? It's ancient history, Eleanor snapped, but the words had lost their authority, brittle now instead of commanding. It has nothing to do with the will. It has everything to do with it, Marianne said quietly. You accused me of manipulating a vulnerable man for money. But David wasn't vulnerable. He was the only honest person in this family, and he spent his whole life ashamed of what the rest of you built your fortune on. Harold cleared his throat, sliding a second folder toward Eleanor's attorney. Legal analysis confirming the document's authenticity, and the very real exposure the family now faced if this history became public record during a contested will hearing. The threat of a lawsuit evaporated in that room, replaced by something far more fragile. The family's realization that the story they'd told for 20 years was no longer theirs alone to control. Eleanor said nothing more. For the first time since David's death, she looked at Marianne not with contempt, but with something closer to fear. The accuser had finally run out of ground to stand on. Ivor, 8. The accuser had finally run. The accuser had finally run. The accuser had finally run. The lawsuit was withdrawn within the week, quietly, without apology, the way cowardice always retreats when it can no longer hide behind confidence. Eleanor's attorney cited family reconciliation in the brief filing, a phrase so hollow that even Harold allowed himself a small, tired laugh when he called to tell Marianne it was over. She didn't celebrate. She simply exhaled, for what felt like the first time in months. The whispers that had followed her through grocery stores and old friendships reversed direction almost overnight, the way rumors always do once the truth becomes more interesting than the lie. She didn't need to defend herself anymore. The documents had done that, quietly and completely, in rooms she never had to enter. She thought, more than once, about releasing everything publicly, about letting the world see exactly what Eleanor and her late husband's father had done to Thomas Reyes, about watching the family's carefully polished name collapse under the weight of its own history. David had given her that power. She held it for weeks, turning it over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by handling. In the end, she chose something quieter. She used part of the estate to establish a scholarship in Thomas Reyes's name, quietly reaching out to his surviving daughter, restoring in small measure what greed had once stolen. She kept the house, the company shares, the life David had built with an honesty his own family had never understood. She let Eleanor keep her silence, her shrinking circle of loyal illusions, her hollow victories at dinner parties. No one important attended anymore. Revenge would have felt satisfying for a moment. Grace felt like something she could live inside for the rest of her life. On the anniversary of David's death, Marianne visited his grave alone, kneeling where Eleanor had once humiliated her, and whispered the only words that mattered now. I proved you right.